session on future work, looking at the project economy. So it's very much unlike the gig economy where it's very input based, the project economy is much more output based. And the project economy has been growing. And among the high-skilled freelancers, the project economy is actually 5 times larger than the gig economy. So despite all the media attention that the gig economy gets, the project economy actually is much, much bigger. And interestingly enough, among high-skilled freelancers, their earnings are more than 100% higher than those of equivalent employees. So they add a huge amount of value to businesses. So what we want to explore here is why is it, or how is it that freelancers add so much value to businesses? Because it's those reasons that are driving the growth of the project-based economy. And of course, it's those reasons that are causing more and more freelancers to be hired by companies. And of course, if you are a freelancer, you will want to know what these 5 areas are, because these are essentially your selling points in terms of engaging with companies. So the first one relates to specialization of labor. And if you think of it this way, and construction, I think, is often a good example. If you take a construction project, there are a huge array of different skills used on that project. You have people looking at the electrics, brickwork, groundwork, roofing, scaffolding, and so on. Now, the thing about all those specialized skills involved in all that activity is that they're only used for a small proportion of the time. And if you wanted to use an employee-only basis to actually run a construction site, on a construction project, then you'd need kind of jacks of all trades. You need the person who's doing the electrics to also do some brickwork. Because the electrics are only account for about 10 or 15% of a project. Equally, the brickwork only accounts for about 10 or 15%. In fact, if the person did the electrics also did the brickwork, they'd actually probably need to do some roofing as well. And so what would happen then is that in order to do a construction project, you wouldn't be able to use specialized labor. You'd need a series of jacks of all trade. And what we know from management, and we know from economics for centuries since Adam Smith, is that specialization of labor leads to much higher productivity. So using a freelance workforce, companies are able to use specialization of labor because they only have to pay the labor for the period of time in which they're active on the project. And in the high skill sector, that's a win-win situation, not just for the companies in terms of the productivity gains, specialization of labor, but as we know from the earnings data, that those freelancers are able to secure enough work across a range of projects to actually earn income way in excess of the equivalent income of employees. So specialization is the first element. The second element is in terms of managing risk. And here we're looking at growing companies where they start to get on more business. And as they get on more business, then they need to take on more workers. But if the company isn't actually certain that growth in business is going to continue, or that higher level of activity is going to continue, then they understandably would be worried about taking on new projects, simply because if the volume of business drops, then they could be left with a whole bunch of employees on the payroll and not enough income to actually pay them. So what the freelance model enables businesses to do in the project economy is it allows businesses to treat this extra or uncertain growth as projects, and to predominantly hire a freelance team to work those projects. And if those projects turn out to be sustainable, in other words, that that volume of business turns out to be sustainable over a longer period of time, then what the company can do is it can replace those freelancers by employees. So what we see in business in the 21st century is increasingly using a freelance workforce to actually grow. And the freelance workforce is always doing the risky part at the front. And as the business grows and is certain that this new volume of business is certain, then it gradually replaces the freelancers by employees. So it moves to an employee model. So in fact, those employees, their jobs wouldn't exist without the freelancers, because the company they work for would probably find the risk, often in many projects, would find the risk too high to grow. So in a sense, it breaks some of the myth that people often view that freelancers actually take away the jobs of employees. And indeed, they of course they do in the gig economy, and particularly in low skill sector. But in the project economy, and a lot of the areas in which freelancers add value actually creates employment, and de-risking growth is one of them. The next area in which freelancers add business is in terms of enabling businesses to draw on talent outside the confines of their own employee base. So take Arm Holdings, for example. Arm Holdings, when it was set up in Cambridge, was taking on Dell. And I think people at the time thought they were off their rocker, perhaps, in terms of doing such a thing. I mean, Dell was the dominant supplier of computer chips, hugely cash rich, massive R&D team. How on earth could a small company actually take on such a big organization? Well, what Arm banked on was the fact that although Dell had a huge and impressive team of R&D workers, they figured that compared to the entire global workforce of freelance workers in that area, that global workforce was superior to the employee workforce that Dell had in its R&D unit. And that's what Arm tapped into. So they used a freelance model to skill up the various projects that they had relating to individual chip design. So when they were looking at developing a particular chip design, they figured out what skills they needed, and then they were able to draw on the very specialized skills in the freelance labor market to fill those. And over a period of time then, they not only were able to compete with Dell, but actually dominate the market. And now, of course, are a 40 billion business. The next area in which freelancers add value to business is in innovation. When you've got a successful large organization that is already doing very well selling a product or service, one of the things you don't want your staff to do is to take their eye off the ball in terms of concentrating and really serving that market. But unfortunately, innovation is the very thing that will take their eye off the ball, because innovation gets them to start to look in other directions and so on. So increasingly what companies are doing is they're moving the innovation activities into projects. So they're creating a project team that looks at the innovation. And rather than draw from employees who are often dealing with the core, they will often draw on a freelance team. And often they need to draw on a freelance team because they don't have the skills in-house to deal with the particular activity. So a good example of this is the creation of Argos Direct. And when Argos Direct was being set up, Argos, of course, was already a big successful company on the high street. And they didn't certainly want their employees starting to take their eye off the ball. So they set up a team to launch Argos Direct. And of course, they need a whole host of new skills, because they needed all the IT skills, all the web sales skills, and so on. So they put a freelance team with a small number of employees together to work on this project. And they launched Argos Direct, which was very successful. And the company was sufficiently risk averse in terms of this. I mean, they de-risked this innovation by using this approach, but they were sufficiently risk averse that I actually waited for 2 years before Argos Direct was integrated back into the company. And by then it had a turnover of over 100 million. And the net effect of all this is that companies that use a freelance project-based model and can add a huge amount of value to their business. So we've done research on this, and we found that in order to generate these benefits, you must have at least 11% of your workforce accounted for by freelancers. And So in other words, if you use freelancers to fill in short-term needs and so on, then you won't generate the benefits. But if you are using the project-based approach and using freelancers for the reasons that I've mentioned, then typically it will take the business over at that 11% mark. So as you can see in today's entrepreneurial and fast-changing market, being agile and being innovative are key. And therefore, for those reasons, freelancing has a great future. But now that effect has been amplified because along came COVID-19 and actually forced companies to manage their employees in a way that is very similar to freelancing. So, and in doing so, they have reduced some of the skepticism and fears that companies have about using freelancers. So companies were always a bit skeptical about having freelance workers who worked remotely, about freelance workers who they couldn't monitor their activity on an input basis and had to trust them to deliver on an output basis. Now, a lot of companies, of course, were very happy to do that, and that includes the examples I mentioned. But most companies were very reluctant. And COVID-19, by forcing remote working, and of course, there's a mixed view on it, but there's no question that as we move back from the COVID-19 environment to move beyond the post-COVID-19 environment, that work will ever go back to the way it was. So there will be a much higher proportion of remote working in the post-COVID-19 environment than in the pre-COVID-19 environment. And as a result, that will actually enhance the level of freelance activity, because that type of work is very conducive in terms of freelancers. Freelance is very good in terms of managing their own time and so on. So I think it will cause more and more companies to use freelancers and indeed to adopt project-based methods, and hence will expand the project-based economy. There will, of course, be more competition internationally as geography becomes less important, and that will mean that freelancers will need to compete more intensely, not just with freelancers in their own economy, but internationally. But I think one way or the other, I think when you put all of these forces together, I think what we can see in terms of the future of work is that in the high skills sector, freelance work and project-based management are not just here to stay, but will thrive into the future. Thank you.